The first time the HOA came after me, it wasn't with a warning or a polite letter. It was with a bright orange citation slapped on my door like I was some criminal. My so-called offense? Something so harmless it still blows my mind. One minute, I was enjoying a quiet afternoon in my own yard. The next, I was being treated like I'd broken the law. Neighbors peeked through blinds, phones came out, and before I knew it, the situation was spiraling far beyond what any normal person would call reasonable. This wasn't about rules anymore. This was about control. And the real question was, how far would they go to take it? I moved into that neighborhood believing I'd finally found the kind of life people dream about. Wide streets lined with maple trees, kids biking in the summer evenings, neighbors waving as they watered their lawns. It looked like the perfect place to raise a family. After years of saving and sacrificing, I had scraped together enough for a modest home on the edge of the community, one with a little backyard where my son could play, and where I could finally breathe without the noise of the city pressing in on me. At first, everything seemed right. Mornings started with the sound of birds, evenings with the glow of porch lights flickering on as families settled in. My son quickly made friends with the kids down the street, and my wife loved how close we were to the lake. To me, that lake was the crown jewel of the place. Calm water reflecting the sky, a refuge where I could teach my boy the kind of simple joys I'd learned from my father. How to bait a hook, how to skip a stone, how to respect nature. It wasn't luxury, but it was peace. And after years of hustle, peace was all I wanted. Like any community, there were rules, posted signs about parking, lawn care, and keeping pets leashed. I didn't think much of it at first. I believed rules kept things organized, that they were meant to keep everyone happy. The HOA's newsletters slipped into our mailbox every month, a neat little packet of reminders and community updates. I barely skimmed them, tossing them aside after a glance. It never crossed my mind that those papers would eventually dictate nearly every part of my daily life. Neighbors seemed polite, though there was something about the way conversations would pause when the HOA president walked by. She was a sharp-eyed woman with a clipped voice and a habit of looking at people's yards longer than she looked at their faces. Still, I brushed it off. Every neighborhood had someone like her, the type who cared too much about rules and appearances. As long as I kept to myself, I figured she'd never bother with me. But there were hints, small ones, that this wasn't going to stay the peaceful refuge I'd imagined. A neighbor once warned me about keeping the grass at regulation height. Another mentioned how the HOA could be strict about lake access. I smiled and nodded, not realizing those were warnings dressed as friendly advice. I thought I was in control, that as long as I paid my dues and minded my business, no one could tell me how to live on my own property. I was wrong. What began as small glances and clipped reminders was about to grow into something far bigger. That serene lake I loved, the one I believed was open to every resident, was about to become the battlefield where the HOA decided to draw its line. I had no idea how quickly a quiet afternoon would spiral into shouting, fines, and a phone call that turned my life into a public spectacle. Looking back, the signs were there from the beginning. I just didn't want to see them. The first real clash came quietly, almost laughably minor, but it planted the seed of everything that followed. It was a Saturday morning, clear skies, and I was out back trimming a branch that had grown too close to the fence. That's when I noticed a folded note tucked beneath the handle of my back gate. I thought it was a neighbor's invitation or even a kid's prank. Instead, it was a formal notice of violation from the HOA. The reason? My garbage bins were left visible from the street for longer than community standards allowed. I blinked at the page, half expecting it to be a joke. My bins were on the side of the house, not the front, and had been there since the day I moved in. Still, the letter was stamped with an official HOA seal, signed at the bottom, and demanded a $75 fine. I remember the mix of disbelief and irritation. This was my home. My bins weren't bothering anyone, but it was easier to pay the fee and move on. That's how they get you. Little annoyances that feel too small to fight. The problem was, it didn't stop there. 2 weeks later came another letter. This one claimed my grass was half an inch above acceptable length. Another fine, this time $100. I stood in the yard with a ruler in my hand, furious, wondering who in the world walked around measuring people's lawns. I cut the grass twice that week just to be safe. But by then, the pattern was clear. I was being watched. At first, I told myself it was just overzealous rule enforcement. Maybe they were cracking down on everyone. But when I started talking to my neighbors, I realized something chilling. Most of them had never been fined. They nodded sympathetically when I mentioned my letters, but avoided eye contact, lowering their voices as if we were discussing something dangerous. One neighbor leaned closer and whispered, "It's better if you just do what they say. Don't push back. They'll make it worse." That's when I realized I wasn't just living under rules. I was living under surveillance. The fines escalated. A $200 charge for a decorative wind chime deemed out of community aesthetic. I received a $250 fine for leaving my car parked in my own driveway overnight. They said it violated long-term parking rules even though I had no garage. Every week another notice appeared, each one more absurd than the last. But the lake was where the real battle began. One evening I took my son down to the dock with a couple of fishing rods. He'd been begging me for weeks to teach him. We'd barely dropped our lines into the water when I heard sharp footsteps behind me. I turned to see the HOA president marching across the dock, her face tight with disapproval. "You can't do that here," she snapped. I laughed, thinking she must be joking. "It's a lake," I said. "We're just fishing." Her eyes narrowed. "Fishing is prohibited without HOA approval. You violate Section 14B. I stared at her, rod in hand, my son looking up at me confused. "There's no sign," I argued. "There doesn't need to be a sign," she shot back. "It's in the handbook." Before I could reply, she pulled out her phone and started filming us. Within minutes, 2 neighbors appeared on the dock, phones raised, capturing every second like we were criminals being arrested. The president pointed at me and shouted, "This will be reported." The next morning, a certified letter arrived, a $600 fine for unauthorized use of HOA property. That's when the knot in my stomach turned into something sharper. This wasn't about lawn height or garbage bins anymore. This was about control, and I wasn't the only one noticing. Other neighbors quietly shared their own stories. One family was fined for hanging a Halloween decoration deemed offensive. Another was penalized for having the wrong shade of curtains visible from the street. But everyone was afraid to fight back. The HOA had lawyers, and more importantly, they had the power to place liens on homes if dues or fines went unpaid. People were terrified of losing everything. I should have walked away, swallowed my pride, and paid the $600. But when I saw the fear in my son's eyes that day on the dock, when I realized the memory of his first fishing trip had been ruined by a screaming woman with a clipboard, something inside me hardened. I decided I wouldn't be their next victim. But fighting back was more complicated than I imagined. When I tried to contest the fines, my emails were ignored. When I showed up at a board meeting, they cut me off mid-sentence and told me I was out of order. They used words like due process and community interest to justify everything. Every step of the way, the system was tilted in their favor. It was like shouting into the wind. Then came the night that pushed everything over the edge. We were back at the dock, this time just sitting on the bench. No rods, no fishing gear. My son was tossing pebbles into the water, laughing at the ripples. That's when the president appeared again, flanked by 2 board members. She pointed at me and barked, "You're trespassing!" I stood up slowly. "How am I trespassing?" "I pay the same dues as everyone else." She didn't answer. Instead, she pulled out her phone again, only this time she wasn't live streaming. She was calling 911. My heart dropped as I realized what was happening. She was reporting me to the police for sitting by the water with my son. And in that moment, as blue and red lights flickered in the distance, I knew this fight had only just begun. The night the HOA president called the police over my supposed trespassing is etched in my mind like a scar. I can still see the flashing red and blue lights reflecting across the lake's surface, the way my son clutched my arm tighter as the cruiser pulled up. 2 officers stepped out, calm but cautious, hands resting on their belts as if they were preparing for trouble. "There's been a report of unauthorized activity," one officer said. His tone was professional, but the words carried weight. To my son, it must have sounded like we were in real danger. I pointed to the bench. We're sitting by the lake. That's all. The president rushed forward, waving her arms like she was exposing a fugitive. He's been warned before. He's harassing the community, ignoring regulations and using the property without approval. The officer looked at me, then at her. Ma'am, do you have documentation? She shoved a binder into his hands, pages marked with sticky notes. I caught a glimpse of one tab labeled Infractions, Ongoing. My name was highlighted in neon yellow. I felt a heat rising in my chest. Anger, humiliation, disbelief. My son was watching this unfold, watching his father be treated like a criminal for sitting on a bench. The officer flipped through the binder, sighed, and handed it back. This isn't a police matter, he said flatly. It's a civil dispute. You'll have to take it up in court. The president's face twisted with fury, but she couldn't argue. The officers left, but the damage was done. Neighbors had come out, phones in hand, recording everything. The story wasn't father and son enjoy an evening by the lake. It was troublemaker attracts police again. That was the moment I understood her strategy. She didn't need to win in court or even enforce every fine. All she had to do was humiliate me, isolate me, and make me so miserable that I either submitted or left. But instead of breaking me, it lit a fire. I started keeping records. Every letter, every fine, every interaction. I took photos of my lawn and time-stamped them. I filed formal disputes even when they were ignored. I documented it all, building a case, but fighting the HOA was like punching fog. They moved the goalposts every time I got close. Then came the lien threat. One morning, a letter arrived by certified mail. It stated that unless I paid the accumulated fines, now totaling over $2,000, they would place a lien on my home. That meant they could take me to court and potentially force a foreclosure. Overfishing, over garbage bins, over nothing. I sat at the kitchen table, letter in hand, feeling the weight of it. My wife looked at me with a mix of fear and anger. We can't lose the house, she whispered. This was supposed to be our safe place. Safe place. The words hit me hard. I had moved us here to escape the chaos of the city, to give my son a childhood filled with laughter and peace. Instead, I had dragged my family into a war zone disguised as a neighborhood. But giving up wasn't an option. I started digging into the HOA's finances, the bylaws, and the leadership structure. What I found made my blood boil. They weren't just enforcing rules, they were abusing them. Funds were being redirected without precise accounting. The president had pushed through amendments that gave her nearly unilateral power to approve or deny activities. And the so-called community votes? They were stacked with proxy ballots, which her allies had conveniently collected. The deeper I looked, the more corrupt it became. This wasn't just about me. This was about an entire community being held hostage by a handful of power-hungry people. The turning point came one evening when a neighbor I barely knew knocked on my door. He was older, tired-looking, and he glanced around nervously before speaking. "They've been after me, too," he whispered. "Fined me for putting up a birdhouse. Said it was an unauthorized structure. I paid, but you're the only one standing up to them. Don't stop." That moment changed everything. I realized I wasn't alone. People were watching, waiting, hoping someone would fight back. The HOA thrived on fear and silence. If I broke that silence, others might follow, so I made a choice. At the next board meeting, I didn't just show up. I brought a folder full of evidence, copies of letters, photos, and printouts of financial inconsistencies I'd uncovered. I stood at the podium, heart pounding, and laid it all out. "This isn't about lawns or fishing rods," I said, voice steady. "This is about abuse of power. And it stops now." Gasps rippled through the room. The president tried to cut me off, gavel slamming, but this time, neighbors didn't look away. They murmured, some even clapped. The tide was shifting, but the president wasn't done. Not by a long shot. A week later, a new letter arrived. This one wasn't a fine. It was a cease and desist order, accusing me of defamation and threatening legal action if I continued slandering the HOA. They were trying to scare me into silence, and maybe it would have worked if I hadn't already reached my breaking point. Instead, I doubled down. I contacted a lawyer. I started researching state laws governing HOAs. I found loopholes, contradictions, and violations that could unravel their grip. The more they pushed, the harder I went back, but the fight was far from over. The president still held the reins of power, and she wasn't afraid to wield them. What came next would test not just my resolve, but the entire neighborhood's willingness to stand up against her. Because when power is threatened, it doesn't go quietly. It lashes out. And I was about to learn just how far she would go to protect her throne. The HOA president thought she had me cornered. By the time her cease and desist letter landed in my mailbox, I had already been painted as the neighborhood troublemaker, the one refusing to follow rules. She believed all she had to do was threaten me with lawyers, and I'd fold like everyone else had before. But she underestimated how much I'd been pushed and how much evidence I'd gathered. My lawyer reviewed the documents and nearly laughed. "They're bluffing," he said. "Their cease and desist is meaningless. But what have you uncovered? That could burn their entire operation to the ground." It was the first time in months I felt a surge of hope. But I also knew the battle wasn't going to end with one letter. The president wasn't the type to back down. She was the type to escalate until she got her way. And escalate she did. A week later, I came home to find bright red paint smeared across my driveway. Scrawled in shaky letters were the words, "Rule Breaker." My son saw it first, his small voice trembling as he asked, "Dad, what does that mean?" My stomach sank. This wasn't just fines or warnings anymore. This was intimidation. I called the police, but like before, they treated it as a civil matter. No cameras, no proof, no charges. The HOA president denied everything, of course. But the message was clear. She wanted me out, humiliated, broken. Instead, it hardened my resolve. The next board meeting wasn't like the last. Word had spread about my confrontation, and this time the room was packed. Neighbors filled every chair, some standing in the back, whispering nervously. The air buzzed with anticipation. The president sat at the front, her gavel in hand, flanked by her loyal board members. She smirked when she saw me step to the podium, like a predator watching prey walk into a trap. But I wasn't walking in empty-handed. I brought my binder thick with evidence. Photos, time-stamped records, financial discrepancies, and testimonies from neighbors who had quietly shared their own stories. I started calmly, laying out the timeline of fines and harassment. The audience shifted uncomfortably, whispers rising as I read off absurd infractions. A birdhouse fine, a Halloween decoration fine, a driveway parking fine. People began nodding, some even gasping when I listed the amounts. Then I dropped the bigger bomb. The HOA has been charging residents fines that are not legally enforceable under state law, I said, voice steady but loud enough to carry. And not only that, funds collected from those fines have been funneled into projects never approved by the community. Projects that happen to benefit the president directly. The room erupted, murmurs, shouts, the kind of collective noise that fills every corner. The president slammed her gavel, demanding order, but no one quieted this time. People wanted answers. I pulled out the final piece of evidence, bank statements showing HOA funds used for landscaping on her private property, paid for with our dues. That was the crack in the dam. Neighbors who had been silent for years now spoke up, voices trembling with pent-up anger. One man shouted, "She fined me for my mailbox while she was stealing from all of us!" Another woman raised her hand, tears in her eyes, and said, "I've been paying late fees for months. And this is where the money went?" The president's smirk faltered. For the first time, she looked rattled, but she wasn't going down quietly. "This is slander," she screamed. "He's lying! None of this is admissible. You're all being manipulated by a rule breaker who doesn't care about this community." She tried to storm out, but before she could, my lawyer, sitting quietly in the back, stood up. His voice cut through the chaos. "Actually," he said, holding up a thick folder, "these documents have already been filed with the county clerk's office. If necessary, we'll proceed with a civil lawsuit. And trust me, the discovery process will make this look like a footnote." The room went dead silent. The president froze, her hand on the door, before slowly turning back. For the first time, the balance of power shifted. She wasn't the hunter anymore. She was the hunted, but she had one last weapon, fear. The very next day, new violation notices appeared on my property, 4 of them stapled to my door. They claimed my fence was too high. My lawn too dry, my porch light too bright, and my mailbox non-compliant. Each one carried a fine of hundreds of dollars. It was a desperate move, but also a dangerous one. Because now everyone was watching. Neighbors gathered around, shaking their heads, whispering about the insanity of it. Her harassment wasn't hidden anymore. It was public, undeniable, and cruel. That's when the calls started. One by one, neighbors reached out, some timidly, others with determination. They were tired. Tired of being fined, tired of being silenced, tired of living in fear. And now that someone had stood up, they were ready to stand too. Together, we organized. We petitioned for a vote of no confidence, collected signatures, and prepared for a showdown that would decide the future of the entire community. And when the day of that vote came, the tension was electric. Every resident crammed into the meeting hall, voices buzzing with anticipation. The president sat at the front table, pale but defiant, her gavel clutched like a weapon. The ballots were passed out. One by one, neighbors filled them in, some hesitating, others scribbling furiously. When the last ballot was cast, the room fell into an almost sacred silence. The votes were counted slowly, painstakingly, as every eye in the room fixed on the stack, and when the final number was announced, it felt like the air itself cracked. The president had lost, overwhelmingly. The room erupted, not in chaos, but in cheers, applause, tears of relief. Years of fear and silence had been shattered in that moment. Neighbors hugged, clapped me on the back, and even raised their voices in chants of, "No more!" But the president, she didn't accept it. Not yet. She slammed her gavel down so hard it cracked the wood, shouting, "This meeting is invalid! Liars and traitors will not remove me!" Her voice shook with rage, but it was drowned out by the chorus of voices rising against her. And then, almost poetically, the sheriff walked in. Someone had called for official oversight, and he carried the court order confirming the vote's legality. He stepped to the front, calm and authoritative, and said words I'll never forget. "Ma'am, your authority here is over." Her face drained of color. For the first time, she had no weapon left to wield. The room thundered with applause as she was escorted out, her gavel abandoned on the table. The nightmare was ending. But the story wasn't finished. Because after months of fines, threats, and humiliation, I still had one decision left to make: how to turn my victory into lasting change. The sheriff's words echoed in the meeting hall like a bell tolling the end of an era. "Your authority here is over." For months, the HOA president had ruled with fear, fines, and intimidation. And in a single moment, it all crumbled. But as she was led out, clutching her binder like a lifeline, I couldn't shake the feeling that this fight wasn't completely won. People like her don't surrender. They retreat, they scheme, they look for cracks to exploit. Still, for the first time in what felt like forever, the community wasn't afraid. We had seen her stripped of her power, and that vision was stronger than any rule she had ever written. Neighbors who had once whispered behind closed doors now spoke freely. Stories poured out about unjust fines, threats of liens, late-night harassment. It was like watching a dam burst. The anger that had been simmering for years was finally boiling over, but now it was directed at the right target. That night, I barely slept. My mind replayed everything: the red paint on my driveway, the phone calls to 911, the humiliation on the dock with my son. But alongside the anger was something new: determination. The president might be gone, but the system she built was still standing. If we didn't rebuild it, someone just like her could step in. The following weeks were a blur of meetings, petitions, and late-night conversations with neighbors I'd barely known before all this. We formed a reform committee, dedicated to rewriting the bylaws and restoring balance. For the first time, people showed up in droves to meetings, not out of fear, but out of hope. But of course, the president wasn't finished. A letter appeared in my mailbox one morning, this time from her personal attorney. She was suing me for defamation, claiming my accusations had ruined her reputation. I remember laughing bitterly. Reputation? She had been caught stealing HOA funds, abusing her power, and weaponizing rules to crush her neighbors. If her reputation was ruined, she had ruined it herself. Still, the threat was real. Legal fees could drain me faster than any fine ever had. But here's the twist she hadn't expected. I wasn't standing alone anymore. Neighbors I had never spoken to before now offered support, donations, and testimonies. People volunteered to stand in court if necessary, ready to swear under oath about their own experiences. The same community she had tried to divide was now united against her. When her lawsuit finally reached the courthouse, the judge dismissed it almost immediately. The evidence of her misconduct was overwhelming, and her claims of defamation collapsed under the weight of her own actions. Walking out of that courtroom, I felt lighter than I had in months. She had tried one last time to silence me, and it had backfired spectacularly. The climax of this war didn't come from a single punch or a fiery showdown. It came from the slow, crushing weight of truth. It came from a community realizing they no longer had to live in fear. And it came from watching a woman who had once wielded unchecked power leave in disgrace, her gavel abandoned like a broken crown. The day after the court's dismissal, neighbors gathered by the lake, the very place where this all began. Kids skipped stones, families brought food, and laughter filled the air. For the first time since moving in, I looked around and thought, this is what it was supposed to be. But as I stood on the dock with my son beside me, I also knew this wasn't just a happy ending. This was a lesson, a warning carved into the wood of that dock. When power is unchecked, even the smallest rule can become a weapon. And when people stand alone, they're easy to silence. But together, they can tear down even the strongest walls of fear. The climax wasn't just about me beating the HOA president. It was about us. Every homeowner who had been silenced, every family who had lived in fear, every person who had swallowed their anger to keep the peace. That night, under the glow of porch lights and laughter by the lake, it wasn't her name that mattered anymore. It was the simple truth we had reclaimed. The community belonged to us, not to her. And as the sun dipped below the trees, painting the lake gold, I turned to my son. "Remember this," I told him softly. "Never let anyone take away your voice, because in the end, that was the real victory." The storm had finally broken. The HOA president was gone, her grip shattered, and the lawsuit dismissed like dust in the wind. For months, every step through my neighborhood had been weighted by tension, by the invisible chains of someone else's control. Now those chains were gone. But the real work, the lasting change, was only beginning. At first, the quiet felt strange. No more threatening letters in the mailbox, no more anonymous complaints whispered through the grapevine, no more late-night knocks meant to intimidate. I would sit on my porch with a cup of coffee, almost expecting to see another citation taped to my door. But instead I saw neighbors waving, stopping to chat, kids riding bikes without fear of a rule violation looming over their heads. For the first time, the community felt like a community, but healing wasn't instant. The scars left behind by the president's reign of control ran deep. Some neighbors admitted they had avoided speaking up because they feared retaliation. Others confessed they'd gone along with her demands to stay out of her crosshairs. It was humbling to realize how many of us had suffered in silence, thinking we were alone. That was when we made the decision. Silence would never rule here again. We started with the bylaws, the very words that had been weaponized against us. Every line was examined, rewritten, and debated. No longer would vague rules give unchecked power to a single board member. Transparency became the cornerstone. Financial records would be open to all, decisions would be made in public meetings, and fines could no longer be handed down like royal decrees. It was grueling work, hours spent in living rooms and garages, but it was necessary. And for once, people showed up. They cared because they'd seen firsthand what happened when no one did. Slowly, the fear turned into pride. Homeowners who had once dreaded HOA meetings now attended eagerly, armed with ideas instead of anxieties. A neighbor who had never spoken up before volunteered to head the landscaping committee. Another offered to manage communications, ensuring everyone's voice was heard. What had been a dictatorship was becoming a democracy, messy, noisy, sometimes frustrating, but alive. And then came the personal impact, the changes that rippled beyond the bylaws. My son, who had once asked me why the HOA hated us, now watched as neighbors greeted us warmly, as people thanked me for standing up when they couldn't. He saw firsthand that fighting back against injustice wasn't just possible, it was necessary. I could see the lesson settling into him like roots. Never let fear silence what's right. But victory also carried responsibility. We couldn't pretend the past hadn't happened, nor could we allow bitterness to become our new identity. Forgiveness wasn't about excusing the president's behavior, it was about refusing to let her shadow linger. So instead of dwelling on anger, we built something better. Block parties returned, the lake became a gathering spot again, and laughter replaced the whispered dread that had once hung in the air. Months later, I received news that the former president had moved out of town. Some said she couldn't bear the humiliation of facing us every day, and others claimed her own family forced her out. Honestly, I didn't care. Her departure was just another chapter closing, another sign that we had truly reclaimed our neighborhood. But the most potent impact wasn't what happened to her. It was what happened to us. When a new family moved into the community, they mentioned how nervous they'd been about joining an HOA. They'd heard horror stories, seen the memes online. They worried they'd be walking into a minefield of petty rules and power-hungry board members. But instead, they found a community that welcomed them, explained the new bylaws with pride, and invited them to the next cookout by the lake. Watching their relief, I realized just how far we'd come. The resolution wasn't about erasing the conflict, it was about transforming it. Our neighborhood had been tested, fractured, nearly broken. But in the fire of that conflict, we'd found something more substantial: unity, and for me personally, the impact was life-changing. Before all this, I had been the kind of person who avoided confrontation, who let small injustices slide to keep the peace. But standing up against the HOA president had shown me something I hadn't known was there: resilience, a voice, the ability to say no when something was wrong, even if it meant standing alone. Except, as it turned out, I was never truly alone. Looking back, the climax wasn't just the sheriff's intervention or the courtroom dismissal. It was the moment when my neighbors stepped out of their silence. When one by one they decided they weren't afraid anymore. That's the real power of community. Not in rules or fines, but in people standing together when it matters most. The long-term consequence wasn't just a reformed HOA. It was a reformed sense of belonging. The neighborhood became more than a cluster of houses. It became a place where people knew they were safe, where kids could laugh without someone calling it a disturbance, where families could decorate their porches or plant their gardens without fearing retribution. Freedom returned, not as chaos, but as trust. And maybe that's the most powerful takeaway. Fear is only as intense as the silence it creates. When people break that silence, when they stand up, even trembling, they chip away at fear's foundation until it collapses. Years from now, I know my son will remember the red paint on our driveway, the police at our gate, and the humiliation we endured. But more importantly, he'll remember what came after: neighbors uniting, rules rewritten, a president dethroned. He'll remember that when faced with unfair power. His family didn't bow. We fought and we won. And as I sit on the dock at sunset, watching ripples spread across the lake, I realize the final impact of it all: peace. Not the fragile peace of silence and submission, but the enduring peace that comes from justice, from community, from knowing that this place, our home, truly belongs to us. So if you're watching this and living under the thumb of an HOA or dealing with a neighbor who abuses their power, remember this: you're not powerless. You're not alone. And the moment you speak up, the moment you refuse to be silenced, you might find others ready to stand with you. Because in the end, the real story here isn't about one president's downfall. It's about what happens when ordinary people refuse to live in fear, and that's a story worth remembering.